Welcome to the radio frequency seismograph. This is a new way of detecting earthquakes and detecting propagation at the same time. This is the old mechanical seismograph that we all used to. They're very limited because they cannot pre-detect earthquakes. They only detect earthquakes after they erupt, and unfortunately, this is the only way we can detect earthquakes at this moment. This is a picture of Earth in a filter where it shows all the electronic current that flows underneath the ground. And this is also promoted by earthquakes. And as the earthquakes erupt, they create electromagnetic fields. And these electromagnetic fields disrupt the propagation. So now it comes to a point where we say, what would happen to propagation if we remove the sun? And right now the solar flux is still very low, so we can predict that the propagation will happen in the will happen, and despite the sun. What the sun does is propagation is it lowers and raises the lowest frequency that somebody can use. So if you have high flux conditions, your frequency that you use is the 6-meter band or 10-meter band. And if you have no sun, the radio waves will go down to 40 meters or even 80 meters. And the 80 meters that the 80-meter band opens up is very rarely. And this also brings us to the conclusion that the gravity of the moon, as it creates plate tectonics and the plates rub at each other, and the electric nature of the plates, because they're piezoelectric, creates a lot of propagation. And this is the kind of propagation that we can measure with our seismograph. Here is a historic picture of the planetary distribution of telluric currents, and this was in 1936. And this was a daily occurrence that they were actually posting this. And unfortunately, with our new high-tech environment, we kind of lost that. And it's about time that we regain this knowledge and to understand how earthquakes can affect propagation. So there's the crustal electric currents independent from electromagnetic field generated by the core. There's the ground flow of electricity, those are the telluric currents. And since the electrons have also mass, they're also subject to the tidal effects of the moon. And as the moon rotates over the planet, it pulls and stretches the planet, and this also creates electromagnetic fields via piezoelectricity. And this motion creates vast amounts of electrons by releasing electrons while it microfractures the rock. So here is a picture of how I envision the earthquakes affect the propagation. And at this time, because of the low solar flux, the main effect on the earthquakes is the 40-meter band. And as the propagation changes and the field lines move up from the ground, and they create rifts on the shock waves into the ionosphere. And these shock waves last for 5 to 2 hours or 4 hours, and it follows the propagation on 40 meters very nicely. And we're going to have a graph later where we should see the distribution of how propagation changes by the effect of the earthquakes. How do radio frequency seismograph work? The radio seismograph works by detecting propagation. So this is done by having a receiver which is the main RF seismograph here in Lynn Valley, and this receiver is tuned to the frequencies that are mostly used by ham radio operators, which are the digital frequencies. The RF seismograph has a scanning feature, so it scans 6 bands and measures the propagation on 6 bands and does that 24 hours, 24/7, and it's automatic and it just records the propagation. And the interesting part about this is that because radio waves propagate through the planet, we can basically detect earthquakes around the world with one RF seismograph here in Lynn Valley. And the reason why this works is because we have 10 or even 100,000 of other radios around the world where other people transmit their digital signals. And when there is a propagation window, which is created by earthquakes, our seismograph will detect it. So here is a picture of the ionosphere, and when you think about it, the ionosphere is a really strange thing. It reflects radio waves, and that's really strange because radio waves are usually go in a straight line. And this really is a really interesting medium to measure all kinds of things that happen around the planet. So we can detect all kinds of things via the ionosphere by bouncing radio waves off and see how they reflect. And that's radio, shortwave radio. So here's another picture of how we envision how the magnetic field lines are created. So we have a subducting oceanic lithosphere that goes down, and as it rubs against the continental lithosphere, that creates a lot of pressure. So it moves up and down, and while it moves up and down, it creates not only earthquakes, but it also creates some sort of background noise that can be measured. As the electricity builds up, and the uh, the the earthquakes are concentrated, the field lines pop out of the ground, and we found that the field lines actually like to pop out of the ground where you have fault lines because it's easier for them to penetrate, and uh, and that what creates the propagation. It creates a sort of a dome, and it also creates the shock waves that move over. And these shock waves can last from 5 minutes to 4 hours and create the propagation, especially on 40 meters this time. And here we go, another picture of this, and we go on a little bit further out. And this is an important picture because it displays of what earthquakes really do. And my realization came about this is because when I watched the USGS geological survey, how many earthquakes there are. Like if they go down to 0.1 Richter scale, and the Earth never really stops shaking. So it's interesting because what that opportunity is that the earthquakes are actually creating a force, like a magnetic force, that forces the ionosphere away from the planet. So earthquakes are actually quite beneficial to life here on the planet because it makes sure that the ionosphere is at a certain distance and doesn't come any closer. And when we see this on the daytime, there's a earthquake holding it against, and then as we go to the night side on the other side, the uh, the force of the sun is diminished, so the earthquakes have a chance to push out the field further. So that would make understandable how we can get further on shortwave radio in at nighttime. because the ionosphere is further out. Here's another picture, an earlier picture, and this just shows how the radio waves bounce as the earthquake develops. As the earthquake develops, it creates a sort of a dome and it sends out the ionosphere. And as the radio waves bounce around, you have radio waves that connect, like the ones at the bottom, and then you have radio waves that just go out in the space. And this is the behavior that the RF seismograph detects. Here we have the graphical display about the RF seismograph. What is interesting about this is that we can see how propagation attenuates and enhances. And it's not necessarily the earthquakes, the big earthquakes that create that. It's the little earthquakes. And that was a real realization that we have, like when we look at the attenuation at 1800 hours, there's two small quakes indicating as a green arrows, and they blank out the propagation. And those are probably local quakes. So we need to look at that further. But then, 90 minutes later, the propagation comes back, and then it becomes back because we have a 5.3, and that attenuates again as with little quakes after 2300. So it's tug of war between propagation and non-propagation, and these windows last about 4 to 5 hours or even shorter at the maximum. And this is a very fast and rapid change that I think cannot be supported by solar events. And that's for, we think that earthquakes are the cause of propagation. But here, when you look after 10 o'clock, you see there's there's a 5.5 and a 5.4. And they create quite a lot of propagation here on 40 and 20 meters. And as the quakes wane, there's also some little quakes. So it's a really difficult. It's not. We can't say that one quake creates propagation. It's a multitude of quakes. Like I've seen propagation come up when you have two uh, medium-sized quakes in the vicinity of about 1 hour or so, which would be about what you see here, and that would last about 4 hours. Like this is the window is 2 hours, so it's 4 hours. This would be like a 4 hours, 5 hour opening, but it never lasts longer. It's like always a tug of war with the earthquakes, and it's not necessarily caused by the solar wind. So here we see the RF seismograph using a TS9, an FDE 950, which is a really nice radio. And the way we make the RF seismograph work is by tapping off the 455 kilohertz IF and inside the radio, and it goes into a gray box where we have a converter that converts it down to 12 kilohertz, and this 12 kilohertz is plugged into a sound card, and that sound card can now very minutely measure the outcoming RF and assign it to the graph that is shown on the RF seismograph image. And this is a very effective way of adopting a shortwave radio into a RF seismograph. The only other thing is what you need is a big antenna, which in the background is a HD 18. It's an 18 HDJR antenna. This is about 36 feet tall, and it's multi-band, which is beneficial. And we seem to think that the antennas mostly work if we have resonant antennas. Resonant antennas seem to show the effect of the earthquakes and the propagation much better than non-resonant antenna. And this is a very good antenna. It's maintenance free almost if it's put together. And I have it on my roof, and it really works well. Here is another graph that we want to show the little things that earthquakes do. And this would be really something that if somebody wants to write a piece of software that goes through our data and fix out the points of interest. So they have mostly spikes in that are really big, and these are caused by the magnetic field lines as they break. This is an earlier version of the RF-Seismograph, and one of the early versions where we started to create uh, images, little spikes where the earthquakes are, and the earthquakes are like the earthquakes. The small earthquakes are the green ones. The other ones are the medium-sized ones, and as it get bigger, they become red, and then bigger than M5.6, they're purple. But we get a lot of these small quakes, and these small quakes create quite a lot of propagation and change in the way radio waves behave. And this is a sort of a picture where we want to show that we can associate spikes and certain patterns that we see from the RF seismograph to specific earthquakes, and the earthquakes create propagation. One of the easiest ones to see is the one at the 2200 hours, where you see the 20-meter propagation comes up, and this is created by the earthquake, that little white spike. And we started to create a global map of that shows you where the earthquakes are located, and we will have later include in this map, we will include the this whisper information that records the passes. So our guess is that once we have this together, that once there is an earthquake, the whisper models, the whisper propagation will show that the propagation goes right over certain earthquakes, or if we have a strong earthquake, that the propagation is attenuated over certain earthquakes. And the way the seismograph measures propagation is it does two things. I call it a semi-passive measurement, and that is basically when you have a flat line, and that gives you the background noise of the band at that time of the measurement. And if you have propagation, there's a sort of additional uh, sort of a solid line that goes higher, and it's kind of like a felt solid, and it looks a little bit like AM modulation. But when you have that AM modulation, and you can see that you have a image graph, it shows propagation, and that's the difference between the our seismograph and other other events or other earthquake measurement equipment that do not show the propagation. And to measure the propagation is essential, because propagation is not created by background noise. So you can actually weed out the background noise, because only the earthquakes create propagation. And hence we have a way to detect earthquakes. Now here is our goal, what we would like to do. Right now we only have one RF-Seismograph, and we're located at the on the ring of fire, and there is a lot of earthquakes, and there's a lot of fault lines that can be used to measure earthquakes via the shortwave radio propagation. So our goal would be to extend our seismograph into other areas, possibly along the ring of fire, to create a sort of a network where we have multiple RF seismographs. And when you have multiple RF seismographs, you can use their runtime information, and you could possibly locate the earthquakes before they happen. The RF seismograph detects earthquakes. The larger one usually have half an hour to 2 hours of precursor that we can see at the moment. And if you could detect these earthquakes, we could probably send a pre-warning to certain areas where earthquakes are supposed to occur. But before you make this solid, of course, you have to come up with a model and then test the model against real earthquakes, and that's what we're trying to do. So we want people to participate. So we uh, we want people to set up antennas and record the change in propagation. Uh, our current station is in Lynn Valley. We have got 5 years of data from propagation, and that's another thing that we want to do is we want to offer that data to anybody who's interested in mining the data and see if they can find the correlation between earthquakes and propagation. And that will be very important to continuing our seismograph. So more locations, we would have more locations, and we would want people to have an unused receiver and antenna to set up the RF seismograph. It's easily being done. All the software is free. All you need is a Raspberry Pi and a sound card, and we can get you set up. And if you have the station and the antenna, and could start monitoring. The more data we have, the more stations we have, the more likely it is we're going to be able to pre-detect earthquakes. Here are the references. So the precursor to earthquakes, if anybody is interested, there is a book out that is quite interesting to read, and talks quite easily about the anomalies of earthquakes, and now we can see them with the RF seismograph. There is also an interesting article about it's called Earthquakes in the Sky from the Scientific American, and it's a very good and very interesting read on how the Earth and the piezoelectric effect can create uh, field lines and electricity that could affect propagation. If you want to monitor earthquakes activity, there's Earthquakes Canada, and of course the U.S. Geological Survey, which has the most complete worldwide record of earthquakes. And this is the database that we correlate our measurement with. And every once in a while, there's an earthquake that happens close to my home, and that the U.S. Geological Survey doesn't catch. I add that into my reports, and it's always interesting to see that earthquakes as small as M2.0 can have an effect on the propagation. So at the bottom here, if you want to download the software, we have the RF seismograph, and it's only running on the Raspberry Pi on the Linux platform, and then we also have the viewer that runs on the Linux platform. The viewer is the software that takes the data that the RF-Seismograph records and displays it in a graph. And it also takes the database from the USGS and matches them together so that we can see what earthquake activities was and what the propagation would be at the time. And this is a sad last picture of earthquake response. It's more like a afterthought, and we need to change that. We have the possibility, a capability to change the world so that we can evacuate areas before they get destroyed by earthquakes. Unfortunately, we can't move buildings, but save a lot of lives, and that's really what we want to do. And if you could help, there's our website, rfseismograph.org. And if you want to join our IO user group, it's groups.io at MDSR Radio. And if you want to get in contact with me personally, there is Alex Schwartz. Email alexschwartz@telus.net. Thank you very much.